So each week, myself and Pastor Mark do a podcast where we answer questions that people have from the church. Normally, people text these in during the service on Sunday or just throughout the week. We get questions all the time. So if you ever have a question about the Bible or the Christian faith, you can either call and leave a voicemail message to 760-814-1223 or just send a text message to 760-814-1223. It comes right to me, and then we go through these questions and give, as best as we can, some sort of a pastoral, or not just pastoral, answer to the question, but oftentimes a biblical question to it. So I got this question yesterday. Someone said, can you talk about the idea of Christian hedonism? I just picked up John Piper's book, Desiring God, and I know I've heard you, Miles, quote from it before, but it's got some thoroughly mixed reviews from people. So what's your take on this book right here, Desiring God by Pastor John Piper? Book came out a long time ago. I read it about 10 years ago, so it's been a while since I read through the book Desiring God. But I've also heard John Piper speak quite a bit, listened to his preaching over the years, and I've read other books by John Piper. And I have to say, one of the things that you find about John Piper, and this is probably true about a lot of people who've written a lot of books, and it's not said necessarily in a negative way, it's just a reality. It is what it is that if you've read one John Piper book, specifically if you've read Desiring God, then you've read all of John Piper's books, because a lot of them are just kind of a take on desiring God from a different perspective. And he kind of opens with a passage or a chapter dealing with missions or worship or retirement or whatever it may be, and then he goes into his typical spiel, because this book, Desiring God, sets kind of like the philosophical framework, if you will, for everything that John Piper basically believes about God and about the scriptures. So he has a philosophical worldview that he's necessarily coined called Christian hedonism. And the basic concept comes from, I guess the basic foundational part of it comes from what's called the Westminster Shorter Catechism of Faith. The first question is, what is the chief end of man? And the Catechism says the chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And John Piper's premise for this book, which he goes back to quite frequently, is that the chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying him forever. So his whole premise is that we ultimately have true enjoyment and true joy in God, and when we do that, he is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. That's kind of his big thing. He keeps going back to those two things. The Shorter Catechism, first question, kind of reframes it. Instead of saying, he says, by enjoying him forever. And the other thing is that we are most satisfied in him. Something like that. I don't know. So that's kind of the premise. But the grounding for this view of John Piper, two things come to mind about John Piper. One, he is this warrior for joy. He's fighting for joy. And yet he perfectly, how should I say it? He himself admits that he struggles with joy. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think a lot of people struggle with having joy. But here is this guy who is a warrior for 50 years of ministry and academia for joy in God, and yet he seems to really struggle with joy. So if you have this philosophical worldview that says that joy is found in X, and then you don't have joy after implementing this for decades, you have to question if maybe your philosophical construct, whether or not it's right. So that would be my first take. Second thing is, John Piper is a big-time Calvinist, a five-point Calvinist, Reformed theology. I don't agree with the Reformed position on soteriology, on salvation. So I don't agree with John Piper's assessment of things. So that flavors everything that he writes, everything that when he's preaching. It also tints the way that he reads the Bible. So he looks at the Bible through a certain presuppositional lens, a certain, I would say, biased lens. And so because he has this construct, this philosophical theological construct, he basically sees everything in the Bible in this way. And so you really see that when you read through Desiring God. And so I find myself, while I'm reading through Desiring God, and I kind of picked it up last night because I haven't looked at it in so long, flipped through it again, and there's just a number of kind of starting points that he begins with that because you start with that starting point, you're going to end up in this area. And I think that his conclusions are good if that's your starting point. But that doesn't necessarily need to be your starting point. Now, I don't have the time to give an example on that because I'd really have to go back through the book and look at some specifics. But that's the general thing, is that he is this guy who's very passionate about finding joy in God, but he seems to really struggle with joy. So I'm wondering if his way of getting to that end is not necessarily working. Number one, I don't want to purely be a pragmatist, but it doesn't seem to be working. And number two, it seems like maybe he's got the wrong starting point if he's not ending up in the place where he thinks he's going to end up. So philosophically, that's a challenge. And the other thing is just the Reformed theology. So do I recommend the book? Kind of. I think it's a relatively good book. It's pretty wordy. I think he kind of circles back on the same themes over and over and over again through the book. So it's one of those books that, well, most books are like this. You get to about page 100 and you're like, I think I've got it. And that's enough. So the other side, I wouldn't recommend it to every Christian because I think that it would kind of tie them up in knots with a philosophical framework that has a certain theological, biblical underpinning, but it's a biblical underpinning from a certain perspective that I don't necessarily agree with. So I hope that answers the question.